Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm your host, Call Your Right. Today, we'll be exploring how sponsors can translate ICH E6 R3 guidance into actionable practices with a special focus on data governance, proactive risk management, and real-time oversight. Before I introduce our guests, just a quick note that we'll be taking questions throughout the session, so feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box below at any time. And feel free to chat us. I've seen a couple of chats come through already as we've gotten started here. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. So our first panelist is Donna. Donna Dorozinski is currently the president and CEO of Just in Time GCP, a clinical compliance services and consulting firm that supports pharma and biotech companies in managing their clinical trials. Donna has over 30 years in drug development with extensive expertise in good clinical practice compliance, regulator inspection preparedness, TMF management, clinical technology implementation and optimization, and the processes that support clinical trial management and oversight. She is a member of the TMF Reference Model Steering Committee and a member of Association of Women Entrepreneurs. Donna is also a registered nurse and a founding member of the Society of Nurse Scientists, Innovators, Entrepreneurs, and Leaders. She serves on the board of trustees at Gwynedd Mercy University, where she received her BSN and also has an MSN from Widener University. I'd also like to introduce Bryce Luger. Bryce is a director of product at True Technologies, where he focuses on giving sponsors real-time visibility into what's happening at their clinical sites. He has over a decade of experience building and delivering disruptive technology with a focus on risk identification in management in highly regulated industries. Before joining True Technologies, he held senior solutions and product roles at leading financial technology firms, including Oak North and Abrigo. Before I turn it over to you, Donna and Bryce, thank you for joining us today. I
Morning.
would like to kick things off with a quick poll question, just to get a better sense of who's joining us today, what your priorities are, and help us tailor our conversation a little bit. So we have a poll question you should have just seen pop up. When do you expect your next regulatory inspection? Is it within 6 months, within 12 months, within 18 months? No inspection expected, or you're not sure. So we'll just give everybody a second to answer the poll here. Okay. And so we've got some responses in here. I've got about 43% of people are not sure, coming in at the highest. I think 23%, the next highest, no inspection expected. And then we've got about 14% within 6 months. So a total of 24, around 34%, 33%. So about a third of our participants today are expecting an inspection within the next 18 months. And so I have a question here for you all. Donna, I think probably for you first, right? I think as we've looked at the guidance, the concept of proportionality does seem to introduce a little bit of subjectivity into the process here, which can make some people uncomfortable. We've had pretty clear standards in the past. 100% is a pretty clear standard, where people now may be worried that they're either being a little bit too loose or a little bit too strict with their interpretation. I think as an analogy, I kind of see when a lot of companies went to this idea of unlimited leave, right? It's like before I knew how many days I could take, and now I know that it's not actually unlimited. There is a number that's where I reach kind of an unacceptable point, but now I got to kind of feel out what that is, and it may not be exactly the same for everybody given different circumstances. And I feel like that's kind of the situation we're in right now with R3. So really, if you could just give some advice, practical guidance on how do we think about beginning to implement this guidance, in particular, creating some defensible frameworks around risk management and data governance. I would love to get your thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Collier, and thanks for having me this morning. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I see we have some folks from as far away as Pakistan. So super cool to have you all joining us. I think the challenge that everyone's facing is that, like you mentioned, that interpretation. I
Mm,
love the analogy to unlimited PTO, right? Because it's really open to our own interpretation. I think what organizations really need to do is begin to set standards. You
mm,
know, R3 isn't about creating a set of rules. It's really about creating a culture around how we develop drugs today, right? The end goal for all of us, everybody who's on this call today, in the end, we're doing it for the patients. And so the R3 standard really is a way of trying to get us to think about building quality in from the very beginning, right? When you first write your protocol, when you first start to design your study, what are the things that you can do to ensure the success and the quality of the outcome? Nothing worse than a clinical trial that where people invest their time and money and patients make sacrifice where we get no good data at the end, right? Like that's a terrible thing. And so this is
Mm.
really about designing high quality studies that are going to give us answers to our question. Whether the outcome is negative or positive, it's still an outcome, right? The drug worked, the drug didn't work. The device worked, the device didn't work. There are safety issues, there's not safety issues. But how do we design trials that we can actually do, right? We don't want to design a trial that nobody can recruit for, right? Where the criteria for inclusion is so difficult, we
Mm.
can't actually achieve what we want to achieve. So it's about thinking about what are we doing to design a trial that's doable? If we have ePro in our study, what are the things we're doing to put some governance, some guidance around that? So I think as companies think about whether they're having an inspection, and I would just caution you, if you're active in a European nation or MHRA region right now, you're at risk for an inspection, right? So you don't have to wait till you file your application for approval. Those countries inspect once you're active. And so if you're active in one of those nations, then you are at risk for an inspection. It's not about getting ready for the inspection. It's about getting ready to develop drugs in a way that manages risk and that includes quality.
Yeah. I think that's some great insight. Donna, you mentioned something around this idea of identifying the critical factors. I think that's something that comes through in R3 is identifying critical to quality, right? And what are those elements that are critical to quality in a way that you had a sense of it before, but since you were kind of like doing 100% to begin with, you didn't really have to think through which elements of this are critical to quality. And I think that's maybe contributed to some of the way that we've even done protocol design and the increasing complexity is that we haven't had to go through this exercise of thinking through what's actually critical to quality. So how do you think about that? How do you think about identifying the elements of the study that actually are critical to quality and kind of bringing in this element of proportionality to get at the end what we're looking for, which is safe trials that produce good data?
So I'm a big proponent of the line begin with the end in mind. In the end, what do you want to achieve, right? So in the end, we want to meet our primary and secondary endpoint. Like that's the goal. So I always like to start with what are my primary and secondary endpoints? And some really key risk areas that I'm seeing just in the past couple of years is around technology, where we're leveraging technology for our data collection, especially in the space of ePro. ePro's been around a long time, and as long as ePro's been around, I've seen issues, right? So it's almost like if you, as soon as you start to include technology into your clinical trial, you open yourself up for risk. It's not a bad thing. It's an amazing thing, right? Like we're taking it to the point of care, so it's critical. But how we leverage that technology is really important. So I think anytime you put technology into the hands of your patients, or
Mm.
even into the hands of your sites, because I think that's where you start to lose your, I'm going to say controls, but that's where you start to be able to have less of an impact on outcome. And so I think organizations that are leveraging any kind of technologies in their clinical trials, it really is important you start to build some parameters in them. I worked with a company recently who was using an ePro technology for collecting some point of care from data from the patient. And one of the things they ran into is the sites couldn't get the devices to work. So they immediately started to record everything on paper. The problem is the protocol was written so that the device had to be used. So every time they wrote the data on paper, right, they created a protocol deviation, right? So
Mm.
quality by design means thinking about upfront, where are my points of failure? One of my points of failure is when I put a device into the hand of a patient, that's a point of failure. So how do I build some things around that to one, identify when that's happening, right? And then two, how do I actually prevent the issues, right? Let's think about proactively, what are some of the processes I need to put in place to ensure the quality and integrity of that data, which is my secondary endpoint in this particular case.
Yeah. So I'm hearing I think something that's really key here, right, which is that your technology partners are key stakeholders in helping you build out your quality by design, right? Which is that um, we have to think through all of the possible edge cases, and we need to be working with our technology vendors, not maybe necessarily just as vendors, but as partners in the process of design, implementing something that we may not be very familiar with, and thinking through all the potential failure points where we don't work with that technology every day. Bryce, I think that you may have some opinions uh, on putting technology in the hands of patients and technology in the hands of clinical sites, and how technology providers may partner with sponsors in this.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I have a lot of thoughts there, though I'll try to keep them trimmed down. I would say there are really a few things that you want to consider, right? And one is when we look at the governance, it requires not just access to the data that you're capturing, but a pretty clear framework for interpreting and actually responding to it, right? So it's one thing just to capture it, but it's another to actually have a structure and a process for observing the data, analyzing the data, and doing something meaningful with it. And I think in a lot of conversations I've had, there's kind of this assumption that someone's doing that. Someone's watching the data, someone's analyzing the data. But there isn't always a very clearly defined process for that ongoing analysis and interpretation and refinement, incorporating back what we're seeing in the data that we're collecting. And those issues and opportunities often pass by unnoticed. So, one of the things that I think we have seen in our experience is, if by design, I'll just throw a hypothetical out there. If by design you say we could get safety data, some of our top line analysis in maybe 8 to 12 weeks from collection, that's the design, right? Reality doesn't always indicate that we get things that quickly, but let's just assume that it is. It is a missed opportunity if we're not analyzing that data at that point. So building in those checkpoints along the way, taking a look at what we're collecting, trying to find useful analysis from it and incorporate that back into the way that we're operating the trial, I think is very important to using what you capture along the way, as opposed to finding out these insights way further down the line where you have no opportunity for course correction.
So, Donna, you talk about identifying or starting with the end in mind. And Bryce, I think what I'm hearing you say is that there's a conversation even before that, which is what's even the art of the possible here? Like what can we do together so that you can kind of incorporate all of the capabilities into the design, and make sure that you're creating a constant feedback loop with technology. But Donna, to your point, making sure that you're also accounting for all the potential failure points in that technology, and that you all have a plan together going into this about how you're going to work through those, even if they are maybe fringe cases. I want to do a little bit of a transition. I think we've got really great insights on thinking about frameworks, and where do we start with the design process here. We have, I think, another poll question here where we talk about, yeah, here we go. If you all would, how confident are you in your organization's current data governance practices? Is it very confident, somewhat confident, not confident, or you're not sure? So we'll give everybody a second to answer this. And as you're doing this, I see some comments that have come through in chat. But if you all do have any questions that you'd like for include for the panelists here as well, anything that is kind of a burning question or comment that you'd like them to respond to, please do feel free and drop that in the Q&A section or in the chat. Great. Okay. So overwhelming majority of our poll respondents are somewhat confident in their current data governance practices. And then we've got 20% that are not confident, 17% that are very confident, which is great, and then 7% that are not sure, so probably not close to the data governance side of what they're doing. But I guess, as we think about moving from this concept of design to implementation, right? So we've talked about quality design and building frameworks, and I see a trend of, a pretty high proportion that are somewhat confident to not confident in data governance practice. Donna, how do you think about translating design and kind of like the quality by design and these frameworks that we're talking about into actual day-to-day risk management and like actionable insight here?
So this is where I get to talk about my passion, sponsor oversight. I think that's the thing. The word oversight, actually should count the number of times it appears in R3. But I honestly think it comes down to partners. I think, Bryce, you mentioned, right? It's the partners you're choosing to do this. Most sponsors don't have the technology that they need to use. They're relying on their CRO, they're relying on their IRT vendor, they're relying on a lot of vendors to collect a lot of really critical data, right? And so when you're relying on those partners, the first thing you have to do is you have to go about qualifying them properly. Nothing frustrates me more than being brought in to do a retrospective audit of a vendor that's already been selected and the study's 3/4 over, right? It's like, okay, so hopefully we'll find if there's issues, but wouldn't it have been super cool if we actually could have prevented them? Like, wow, think of that. So I think from my perspective, it's around picking good vendors that you trust and that you've qualified. And look, there's no perfect trial. There's no perfect vendor. I've never seen a perfect clinical trial because my whole thing is where there's human, there's error. Okay, I'm good with that. And I'm going to build in things to help protect me. I am, to your point, Bryce, I'm going to look at my data as I go. I don't want to wait till the end of the trial to look at my protocol deviations. Yet, believe it or not, there are still companies today that are not evaluating their protocol deviations. They're a huge opportunity to identify issues early on and implement remediations and preventative actions. So I think picking the right vendor is critical. Having some really good principles about how you manage and review your data, right? Having an IRT system where the sponsor never goes in and actually looks to see what's happening is a recipe for an issue downstream, right? You should be going in because regulators ask you for audit trails. Why do they ask you for audit trails? Because they want to see what's been going on with your data. They want to see what kind of oversight you've had of your data, right? If you're a sponsor and you're not looking at your IRT data, then you're setting yourself up for risk. I've seen issues where a vendor doesn't look at their IRT data, and then we go in and we look at it, we uncover pretty significant issues around dosing, right? Around incorrect randomization. And so where we're relying on technology to do so much of our data collection, we've got to build oversight into that. And trusting your CRO to do all of your oversight, it's like I say, I use this analogy all the time. It's like dropping your kid off at daycare at 6 months and picking them up at 12th grade. While many of us would love to do that, the outcome is not going to be good for any of us.
Yeah. I've got a question in the chat here, Donna and Bryce, and I'll do a little interpolating here, I think, where the question might be coming from. But are there any good technologies out there that can allow a sponsor to manage all their vendor data in one place, including qualification, risk, KPI, performance at study and portfolio level, CAPAs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I think this is getting to, a couple of things. One, that there are some of these problems that become everybody's problem and nobody's problem, which I think is a point that Bryce made earlier, where they just kind of fall through the cracks. And then the other is that there are just so many things to manage. So when you say, well, you can delegate the responsibility, you can't delegate the accountability, ultimately, sponsor, you're responsible for oversight. Well, there's just so much. Like, I've got to make decisions about, where to put my focus, where to give my attention. But wouldn't that be so much easier if we could kind of pull a lot of this data together? So would love for you all to respond to that a little bit.
I'm happy to, do you want to start, Bryce, or you want me to take it?
So I have some thoughts there. I also have a bit of bias too, right? Given the
Okay.
nature of my employment. So
So you give bias and
I'll
then
share
I'll
a
give
quick
perspective.
piece, and I'm gonna punch it back over to you.
Okay.
What I would say is this: In any industry that I've worked in, from a technology perspective, there is never a perfect vendor that accomplishes all things. I think probably the most critical thing that you could consider is, of what I am asking a vendor to do, how well do they do those things and put this information back in my hands in an extremely accessible, usable format? That is what it always boils down to, is data. What controls do I have around the data? How accessible is this data? How timely is this data? How clean is this data? Those are really the considerations that I would put out there, irrespective of the type of vendor. I do know there are a lot of aggregators and the like that exist. So I'm going to push that back over to you, Donna, because I think you may have some less biased insights on the industry.
Yeah, I want to start by saying I truly am vendor agnostic. I never met I really don't know that many vendors out there with a long-term history that don't have good products. I think it comes back to, what are your user requirements? What are your needs from that technology? I see companies make the mistake of picking a technology and then figuring out what to do with it. Start by saying, what do I want my technology to do for me? What problems do I want it to solve? And then finding the technology that best solves that. I also think where companies make mistake is they pick a whole bunch of different vendors and don't think about how they're going to bring all that information back into their organization. So I think one of the things that's really important is, what are you going to do with that data long term? Either your vendor has an archiving capability where you can count on them to retain that information for you in a compliant manner, or you have a methodology for bringing that content into your organization. I've spent a lot of years in the TMF space, just because I believe TMFs are the cornerstone of inspection preparation, not because I have a passion for record management, but I have a passion for GCP compliance. And I think trial master files give you that tool to demonstrate your compliance. So what happens is, a lot of times organizations outsource the management of that to their CRO. And so the CRO actually has a really robust eTMF platform that's integrated with their CTMS, and they're doing all this really cool stuff. And then the sponsor goes to bringing it in-house, and they bring it in on a flat drive or a thumb drive. And so all of the power of that technology that was in that system is gone. It's literally now at the cell level. And oftentimes they don't even bring the archive with them. So they don't even have access to the archive. So in my mind, it's really not about what technology is out there, but what's the infrastructure that's going to support how you identify the technology, select the technology, use it, and then archive the data that comes out of that technology.
It sounds to me, Donna, like this comes back to this kind of like intentional design, right? And end-to-end thinking is that you build all of these really great capabilities into the operational side of oversight, but then you lose all of that capability when you flatten everything out, because you haven't thought about where all of this is going to land and the capabilities on kind of the where we put this. So I think that's it ties back into some themes that I'm hearing around intentionality, end-to-end thinking, and kind of starting with the goals in mind.
And begin with the end in mind, right? It doesn't matter whether it's your data, your design, your whatever it is what do you want the outcome to be, and how do you build the infrastructure to support that?
And I guess so. A follow-up question here, or comment, is around eTMF in risk management at a portfolio level. It's good for study quality, but maybe not for vendor management. How do you think about pulling together from the vendor side, like all of the data into one place?
Right. So I think the caveat there is eTMF versus TMF, right? We know that there is no system out there that can maintain all of your trial master file content, right? So you can have an eTMF where you keep a lot of your content, but your trial master file is the compilation of information that tells the story of your study. So you're always going to have content in multiple systems, including, to the point of the question, program level, like for example, safety, right? So a lot of your safety information isn't really just about the study, it's a program level record. And so you do need a way to maintain that content a lot of organizations that's an afterthought, right? Oh, well, the CRO holds our safety database. Oh, well, the CRO holds all of this, or oh, this vendor holds all of that. You still need to have oversight of that system, wherever that system is, where the content's being held. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of sponsors make. They worry about the ETMF, but then they don't worry about the trial master file on a broader scope. So I think it's really about thinking about all of the systems where this information is held, whether it's program or study. Even if it's program level content, it's still relevant to that study. We're dealing with that a little bit now with the TMF reference model and thinking about those records that are program or product level records. At the end of the day, they're still relevant to a particular study as well. And so you do need to think about that.
I think that's a good opportunity for us to kind of transition to our third poll question here, because I think we've already started touching on this topic, right? Which is this idea of oversight. What is the biggest challenge your organization faces in implementing effective oversight? Limited visibility into site activities, oversight isn't prioritized, lack of clear roles or ownership, technology or resource gaps. And I think as you all are answering the question that we were just interacting with, is around this idea of how are we maybe using vendors to help us have oversight over other vendors, right? And you kind of end up in this chain of vendor oversight of another vendor in this process, and like how do we pull all of this together to either streamline our view and get kind of a consolidated view of this, or maybe get more direct oversight, like from one place to the other without so many layers in between, to streamline some of this vendor management. So I've got some responses here. 50% say technology or resource gaps are the biggest challenge the organization faces. And I think that's what we've seen that in some of the questions that we've gotten here today, right? It's around how do I use technology to see everything that's going on, to manage the vendors who are managing the vendors who are managing the vendors, or find a way to use technology to strip out some of those middle layers and go right to the source. 26% say lack of clear roles or ownership. 20% limited visibility into site activities, and only 5% say that oversight isn't prioritized. So I guess, I'll use this to move us into our last section here. Bryce, maybe you can respond to this. A lot of questions about technology in oversight. And we've talked about the fact that the guidance makes it very clear that while others can be responsible for study conduct, you're bringing in lots of other vendors to be responsible for the activity on the study. The sponsors are ultimately accountable for outcomes. And so how should sponsors think about trial oversight in light of R3? And how can they improve oversight practices to ensure that these trials are both ethical and sound? And in particular, lots of interest in maybe how do we use technology to kind of close these gaps between us and our vendors who are delivering on these activities?
Yeah, I think it's a good question to ask. At its root, right, sponsors can definitely delegate activities, but they can't delegate the oversight, as you mentioned. One of the things in R3, I think, that bubbled out from my perspective as I was reading it, was really encouraging the use of fit-for-purpose technology to actually detect issues and maintain control over the conduct of the study throughout, right? Not way after the fact, not making adjustments later, but finding out as you go, maintaining control over the study conduct. And I think one of the easiest parallels for that in a practical universe for this space is going to be monitoring. There's a concept that I think we throw around in software development, but it applies in project management or manufacturing. You call it the golden triangle or the impossible triangle. Different names for different industries, but the concept is really this. And I'll use it in the frame of cars, right? They can be fast, they can be reliable, they can be cheap. If you want it to be fast and reliable, it will not be cheap. If you want it to be cheap and reliable, it will not be fast. And you can apply that any which way you want, but you're going to get two. You will probably not get the third. So as we think about monitoring, I think historically it's been throw people at the problem or only throw technology at the problem. People definitely aren't going to scale, and technology by itself just won't scale either, right? If we think about people, there can't be a person in the clinic watching every draw, every single tube be processed, calibrating every machine, or accompanying samples on the back of the truck or in a plane on the way to the central lab. Like, you just can't be there the whole time, right? So putting the proper kinds of technology in the hands of the people, right? We will always need people to solve problems. The level of discernment in the human mind is very necessary to ensure quality. But the thing is, what can we do with fit for purpose tools, technology, and visibility into the data to actually enable people to make good decisions? And I think one of the things that pops up for us, right, this is kind of my individual example of things that we handle on a day-to-day basis, is thinking through, I know as Donna mentioned, like critical endpoints, right, primaries or secondaries. My brain often goes to safety, right? We're ensuring the safety not only of the patient, but the study, everything throughout, and the quality of our data. And one of the things that really shocked me stepping into this industry was that trials had occurred where pre-dose safety samples were skipped, but patients got dosed anyways, which really blew my mind. Having technology stops that can catch something like that and escalate it at the point of which it's happening is really important, not only for the safety of that patient, one, but two, the trial itself. That data becomes unusable. And if your time horizon by design is 8 to 12 weeks to analysis, but reality might put you closer to 5 or 6 months, you find that out later. You have an extreme cost to your organization to replace that patient. That's really not a winning formula, right? But if you can utilize technologies, things that are fit for purpose, right? That's kind of the way that I think through this, fit for purpose to solve these problems.
Yeah, so you say that the fit for purpose, and I think that's important, but there's something else that I'm hearing you say that ties into a point that Donna made earlier when she was talking about audits and compliance, not technology at all, which is, could you have brought me in when we could have done something about this instead of when I'm just telling you that something is wrong, right? And so I've got a question in the Q&A box here that I think is around that too. Donna, this is probably more for you. What kinds of qualifying questions can you ask potential vendors or partners to gain insight into their data governance strategy, ensuring transparency and compliance?
Yeah, so many times the answer is, well, let me review the SOPs. And I can't tell you how many organizations I've gone into that have had really robust SOPs, but poor process, right? And so really what you want to look at is what are their process for addressing issues? How do they look at issues that have happened within their organization? And Bryce, you made the perfect example. I mean, I go back to those lab samples, collecting those lab samples, right? And that patient who doesn't get their pre-dose lab samples. There's still a human factor here, right? Somebody made a decision to bypass having that data available. Somebody made a decision. And even in the space of technology, as we get data, we still have to have the human factor. So many people are afraid that AI is going to take over their jobs. Like you hear that. I read everybody, oh, AI is not going to take over your job. They're not. It's going to help you do your job better.
Yeah.
But if you don't take the data that you're provided and do something with that data, at the end of the day, you can't prevent that human error, right? That human ignoring what the data is telling you. And
Mhm.
so SOPs are important. Yes, organizations should have SOPs. But me, I want to know, well, how do you handle when things don't go right? Because that to me really tells me the impact. Oh, you tell me you have all these stop gaps in your system for identifying issues. Well, what do you do when an issue is identified? What's an
Mhm.
example of an issue that's been identified and fixed, right? It's kind of like that question you get in an interview. Tell me a weakness, right? Okay, well,
Mhm.
tell me a weakness. If you sit there and say, I don't have any weaknesses, well, you're not hired, right? If you say, oh, well, this is what, right, this is one of my weaknesses, and this is what I do to kind of counteract that weakness or identify that weakness and how I've turned that into a strength. Okay, there's a win. So when you're going in and you're talking to these organizations, don't just sit and read SOPs, talk to people,
Mhm.
find out what they do, how they do it. And then even after you select that vendor, put processes in place where you're assessing that vendor. I just had a recent experience where with a company that uses 2 CROs for their studies. They use certain types of studies with one CRO, certain types of studies with the other. And they just hired a third CRO to have oversight of those other 2 CROs, right?
Mm.
So all they're doing is kicking the can down, right? What they haven't built is processes to look into those systems. I saw a comment there is, how do we have oversight if we can't see in the systems? That's completely unacceptable. You should not be using any systems to support your studies where you can't see into those systems, right? Because then you can't have the oversight of that information. Today, a lot of CROs maintain their training in their learning management system. And so the sponsors will say to me, well, I don't have any view into the adequacy of the training of my study team. Yet when I'm looking at all the protocol deviations, I'm like, yeah, well, there's issues around monitoring. How do you know that we're trained? So we request a report. Well, we can't give you a report because we're in the process of changing over our system. That's a red flag to me as a sponsor.
Yeah.
I can either go, oh, okay, let me know when you have a report, or I can go, red flag, that's an issue. Talk to me about how you're doing change management. Talk to me how you're moving the data from your existing system into your new system. It's an example of, yeah, the system told me there's an issue, but what am I doing to investigate that issue? What am I doing to have that oversight?
Yeah, and I think this is Donna, you made a comment, I think it was before we started, before we went live. So I want to bring it up again if we haven't gotten to it here. But I do think one of the themes from the guidance from R3 is that it's not about a rubric. It's not about checking a box. It's not about how I get the A. That it's kind of there's been a level of thinking here that it's like, well, what do I need to do to get my A? Right. And what's going to make people a little bit uncomfortable is that this is actually about reintroducing kind of like frameworks for dynamic decision making, right? And frameworks for running better studies. And what you said before we hopped on the call here was it's not about solving to the guidance. It's about running better studies, and the guidance is actually trying to open itself up to have controls in place and have a way that we can still, monitor these things, that we can still know what the expectations are, but also do dynamic decision making and make decisions on what's best for the patient and what's best for the study.
Yeah, so I'm pretty passionate about this because I've seen impact. So I've been doing this a pretty long time, and in my years, I've never seen a drug not get approved because somebody got a 483 for something, what I'm going to call silly, right?
Yeah.
But I have seen delays in drugs getting to patients or maybe not indications getting approved. So one time I saw it was an SNDA for 2 different indications. So the trial actually incorporated the 2 different indications into one study. So a pretty complex design. At the end of the day, there were data integrity issues at a single high enrolling investigator site that resulted in non-approval for one of the 2 indications, right? So absolutely unacceptable to me at the time I saw it. But then I experienced it downstream when a family member had surgery, and their surgery was for the indication that wasn't approved, and another family had surgery for the indication that wasn't approved. And the post-op experience for the patient that had the approved indication versus didn't have the approved indication was very different. So what was a basic non-compliance at a single investigator site is impacting patient care downstream. The other situation I saw is where we identified a data integrity issue in the organization. And we said, this is going to be an issue when you're inspected. The data wasn't bad. It was how the data was managed that was the issue. So it wasn't bad data, but there were questions around how it was managed and what was done with the data. And ultimately, it resulted in a repeat of the data collection to demonstrate what we knew is that the drug worked. But at the end of the day, it was a year delay in getting the drugs to patients. So from a patient and altruistic impact, it's pretty significant. But as an owner, as a business owner, it's also impactful to the organization from a financial perspective, right? Increased resources to repeat the study, increased resources and delays in revenue generation because it took a year longer to get the drugs out there. And so it's not just about doing this for the regulations. It's about doing it for the patients, and it's about doing it because it makes good business sense. Doing this upfront, identifying your issues, setting a framework for quality, It just is good business practice.
Yeah, I mean, good regulation and good regulation design is ultimately should align perfectly with doing what's right for the patient and doing what's
Right.
right for the business.
Right.
And I think there's an opportunity here for us to view it that way, which is that um, this is not something scary. This is not something that is going to require a lot more. I mean, it will require more decision making on the part of the sponsor, but it's also like removing a lot of these things that you were doing and you didn't know why, right? Like I'm checking this box and this has nothing to do with my study, but here we go, box checked, right? And so you're just kind of wasting time. Um, I know we're coming close to time. I have several questions in the chat and in the Q&A, and I do apologize if we don't get to your question today. I'll get these over to Donna and to Bryce and get their feedback, and we can submit something back to you in writing here. But I had one here. There was a question about fit for purpose, right? And Donna, can you elaborate on, Bryce brought it up, but the ICH E6 reference to fit for purpose, and
Right.
we'll
I think
close with
you have to
this.
establish your purpose, right? Like that's the first thing. And it's kind of what I talked about when you're picking your systems. Like what is it you're trying to achieve? Collier, I love that you brought up the data, a volume of data we collect. We collect way too much data. We
Mm,
really do. And we really need to be looking at purposeful data and data that has a reason for being collected because data costs money. It costs money at all levels, right?
mhm.
I did a recent project where at the end of the day, they're like, well, this was only really to give us some investigational insight. And I'm like, okay, but it's bad data. Like, good or bad, like, it's bad data. Why is it bad data? Why did it create a
Yeah.
situation where you have bad data? Don't justify it away. Ask yourself, like, what happened here? So I think fit for purpose to me means that this is meeting the needs of what I needed to do. We can't look at everything. We can't. There's no way. We can't have oversight of everything. But what are the critical quality indicators that are going to tell me that I have a problem with my data? It's different from study to study. I'd love to be able to tell you, oh, in every study it's ABC. And we've
Mm,
been working with this in our organization around trying to identify risk in just managing TMFs or in building risk management programs. It's not going to be a recipe you can hand people. Really, every trial, every organization is different. I saw a lot of questions here about small startup companies. Yeah, it's really hard. And it's actually harder for you than it is the bigger companies that have unlimited resources. But I think the thing I would recommend is it becomes even more critical for you to figure out where your quality risks are. These risk management programs are just as important in smaller organizations as they are in larger organizations. So that's not a place to shorten your resources.
yeah.
I could come over the top there, Collier. Donna said two
Yeah,
things that
please.
really stuck out to me. One, too much data. If you can capture it at the point of source, she mentioned that way earlier in the presentation. If you get it at the source, don't introduce another system that you have to reconcile it between, right? What is the purpose? And if you think through this all along the way, can I get clean information that I need that tells the story that I need it to tell from a safety, a science perspective? It gives me all of what I need. And then I don't have to go deconflict it with another system later, right?
Mhm,
Get it at the source and move on. And there's
mhm.
really one very critical thing. It's like one of the easiest opportunities of low-hanging fruit. Don't introduce unnecessary redundancy.
Yeah,
Moving data from one system to another is in itself a risk indicator. When you're moving multiple pieces of data, multiple locations, it's a risk. You've got to put things in to mitigate that risk.
yeah. Well, look, I have a feeling, Donna and Bryce, that we could talk for a long time, but I think we're getting pretty close here to our scheduled time. So I would like to open it up to any other kind of closing thoughts that you all have, anything that you'd like to leave everybody with today. And
I
we're
think
getting some really great comments coming through. So thank you all. I've got a yes with many S's, an excellent discussion. Thank you. Feeling inspired. Great session. So, Donna, Bryce, thank you so much for joining today. Thanks for the time. I've got somebody asking about a video. I believe there will be a video that we send out to attendees and registrants for the webinar today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Donna, Bryce, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Yes, so a recording will be available later today at truetechnologies.io, and we'll share it with you in a follow-up email. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.